He had been looking forward to this lunch all week. After a long stretch of meetings, negotiations, and endless calls, he wanted a small break, a moment to enjoy himself without worrying about work. The city had a few upscale restaurants he had never tried, and today he decided to visit one that came highly recommended by a colleague. It was the kind of place where people went to celebrate, to impress clients, or simply to feel a touch of elegance in their busy lives. For him, it was just a quiet escape, a few hours to enjoy a meal and a cup of coffee. He arrived right at noon. The city streets were bustling, cars honking and pedestrians moving in all directions, but the restaurant's entrance looked calm, inviting. He stepped out of his car, straightened his suit, and smiled at the doorman. He had been here once before, but only to drop off a client. Today it was personal. Today he was the customer, and he wanted the experience to be simple, pleasant, and relaxed. As he walked toward the entrance, he noticed the hostess behind the desk looking at him with a slight frown. He assumed it was just a casual observation. Sometimes new faces were met with curiosity. He approached the desk politely. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'd like a table for one, please." The hostess looked at him, paused, and shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, sir."
"We can't seat you right now." He blinked, surprised.
"I'm sorry, what do you mean?" She didn't give an explanation. Her tone was polite, almost rehearsed, but her eyes avoided his. "We can't seat you," she repeated. He took a small step back, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I have a reservation." She didn't answer. She just gestured vaguely toward the entrance and said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do." He felt his chest tighten. A mix of confusion and disbelief washed over him. He looked around the lobby. There were other people waiting, mostly white, being seated without hesitation. Some of them smiled at the hostess, got menus, and were guided to tables with no questions asked. He could feel the difference. It wasn't his imagination. "Excuse me," he said, trying to stay calm. "I'd like to speak to the manager." The hostess hesitated. Then she said, "The manager is busy." He pressed a little more. "I don't think this is right. I have a reservation and I'm here to dine." She shook her head again, this time more firmly. "I'm very sorry, sir. There's nothing we can do." At that moment, the air around him seemed to change. The bustling energy of the restaurant felt suffocating, almost hostile. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but a feeling of humiliation began to rise. He had experienced discrimination before, but this felt sharper, more blatant. Standing outside the restaurant now, he felt the stares of people who had been watching him approach. Some were curious, others sympathetic, and a few were judging him silently. He looked down at his hands, wondering if he was overreacting. Maybe there was a misunderstanding, he thought. Maybe the reservation had been lost. But the way the hostess avoided eye contact, the subtle shift in her tone, and the ease with which other customers were seated, told him the truth. It wasn't a mistake. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply stood there trying to process the moment. Every fiber of his being wanted to react, to demand an explanation, to make them understand that he wasn't someone to be dismissed so easily. But he reminded himself to stay calm. Anger could be dangerous, especially in a situation like this. He had seen friends, colleagues, even family members lose control in similar moments, and the outcomes were never good. Instead, he decided to leave. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped away from the hostess desk. The hum of conversation and clinking silverware followed him as he walked toward the exit. He could feel the heat of embarrassment, the heavy weight of unfairness pressing down on him. It was not just about being refused a table. It was the unspoken message, the invisible barrier that had been placed in front of him simply because of the color of his skin. Outside, the city air felt sharp and cold against his face. He leaned against the side of the building, letting himself breathe, trying to calm the storm inside. People walked past, some glancing curiously, some pretending not to notice. A few moments passed and he felt his pulse slow. He could feel the humiliation, yes, but also a simmering determination. This wasn't the end of the story. It couldn't be. He had worked too hard, built too much, and achieved too many things to let a moment like this define him. As he stood there, a man walking by nodded slightly. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened, just a simple nod, a small recognition that perhaps someone else had noticed the injustice. That tiny gesture gave him a little strength. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his suit, and began walking down the street. Back at his office, he replayed the incident in his mind. He thought about the hostess, the way she had avoided him, the subtle but unmistakable difference in treatment compared to other customers. He thought about the manager who had been too busy to speak with him. And he thought about himself, what he could do, how he could respond, and how he could turn this moment of humiliation into something meaningful. He opened his laptop and sent a quick message to his assistant. He described what had happened, providing the time, location, and names he could remember. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He let himself feel the sting of what had happened, but he didn't dwell on it. Instead, he focused on what he could control, the next steps, the plan, the response. He remembered all the times he had been underestimated, dismissed or ignored in boardrooms, meetings, and even casual social settings. He remembered the long nights of work, the sacrifices, the hours spent proving himself not just competent but extraordinary in a world that often overlooked him. This moment, though painful, was just another obstacle, and obstacles, he knew, could be turned into opportunities. He picked up his phone and called his assistant directly. "I need all the information you can get on that restaurant," he said. "Who owns it? Who manages it? Who decides staffing?" His assistant hesitated for a second, perhaps sensing the weight of the situation. But he pressed on. "I want every detail, and make sure you note the staff involved. I want names, positions, schedules, everything. This is important." While the assistant started gathering the information, he sat back and thought strategically. This was not a time for rash decisions. It was a time for careful planning. He knew that acting impulsively could backfire. He needed patience, intelligence, and precision, but he also knew that he couldn't ignore it. Injustice left unchecked only becomes stronger. The city outside continued on its rhythm, completely unaware of the small but significant drama that had unfolded in the last 30 minutes. Cars passed, people laughed, others argued, and the world moved as if nothing had happened. But for him, nothing was the same. His perspective had shifted, sharpened by the sting of discrimination. And deep down, he knew he had the means to make a difference, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might face such treatment in the future. An hour passed. By then, the assistant had compiled a detailed report, names of the hostess, manager, owner, and even reviews from previous customers that hinted at patterns of behavior. He looked at the list and nodded. This was more than enough to begin, but he didn't rush. He let the information sink in, studying every detail, analyzing every possible angle. He thought about the moment when he had been turned away, and he imagined the various ways he could respond. He could take legal action, of course. That would have consequences, but he wanted something more. He wanted a response that would be intelligent, fair, and strategic, something that would send a message without stooping to revenge. As he sat there, the hum of the office around him, he made a silent promise. This incident would not define him, but it would be remembered, and it would serve as a turning point. The humiliation he had felt outside that restaurant would soon be outweighed by the impact of his actions. He stood up, straightened his suit once more, and walked toward the window, looking out over the city. He felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and determination. This was just the beginning. The story was far from over. And when it concluded, it would be a story of power, intelligence, and justice. Not just for him, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed or underestimated because of who they were. The lunch he had once looked forward to was gone, replaced by something far more significant. An opportunity to turn injustice into action, humiliation into strategy, and pain into empowerment. And in that moment, he smiled slightly, knowing that the next steps would not just be a response, they would be a statement. After the incident at the restaurant, he returned to his office feeling a mix of emotions. The initial shock and embarrassment were still there, lingering like a shadow, but now they were accompanied by a determination that had started to grow steadily in his chest. He sat at his desk, leaned back in his chair, and let himself replay the moment. He remembered the hostess's polite but firm refusal, the manager who had been busy, and the way other patrons had been welcomed without a second thought. He could feel the sting of discrimination all over again, but now it was sharper, not because he was hurt, but because he realized how often people like him were underestimated, dismissed, and ignored. He picked up a pen and started jotting down notes. He didn't want to act impulsively. He wanted to understand, to plan, and to make sure that any response he took would have the weight of intelligence behind it. This wasn't just about a single lunch or a single moment of humiliation. It was about sending a message that discrimination, subtle or overt, could not stand unchallenged. He began by thinking about the restaurant itself. What kind of place was it? Who owned it? How was it run? He had always been fascinated by businesses, by the way a single decision could ripple outward and affect hundreds of people. Now he was looking at this restaurant through the lens of strategy. Every small detail, the layout, the staff, the management mattered. He thought about the owners, wondering if they even knew what was happening at their establishment. Perhaps they would care if they did. Perhaps they wouldn't. Either way, he needed information. His assistant had already started compiling everything. Names of the hostess and manager, schedules, ownership details, reviews from previous customers, and even social media mentions. He reviewed every detail carefully, making notes and drawing connections. He noticed patterns that others might have ignored. Previous complaints about staff behavior, subtle remarks and reviews that hinted at discrimination, and small but telling comments about the service. Each piece of information was a clue, a small thread he could pull to understand the bigger picture. As he worked, he reflected on his own life. He remembered the long hours he had put into building his company, the sacrifices he had made, and the countless times he had been underestimated. People had doubted him when he started, laughed at him when he proposed bold ideas, and ignored him in rooms full of influential figures. And yet here he was, running a successful business, respected in his industry, and admired by many. That thought gave him a quiet strength. He had overcome obstacles before. He could do it again, but this wasn't just about him. He thought about the countless people who might walk into that restaurant one day, hoping for a pleasant experience, only to be treated unfairly because of the color of their skin or the way they looked. He realized that if he acted wisely, his response could do more than address his personal humiliation. It could make a statement that reached far beyond a single building or a single city block. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. He let himself imagine different scenarios, different ways to respond. He could take legal action, sure, but that would take time and might not have the immediate impact he wanted. He could make a public post calling out the restaurant, but he didn't want to appear reactive or petty. He wanted a response that was smart, measured, and powerful. He wanted a solution that combined justice with strategy, embarrassment with awareness, and consequence with education. After a few minutes of reflection, he began to form a plan. He would approach this not as a personal vendetta, but as a strategic action. He would gather allies, leverage his network, and use the tools at his disposal to ensure that the restaurant faced real consequences for its behavior. But he would do it in a way that demonstrated intelligence, composure, and professionalism. He didn't want to humiliate anyone unnecessarily. He wanted to make a statement that discrimination was unacceptable and that those who allowed it would be held accountable. He picked up the phone and called a few close colleagues, people he trusted implicitly. He explained the situation without exaggeration, focusing on the facts, what had happened, how he had been treated, and the broader implications. As he spoke, he could feel their support and understanding. They didn't offer pity. They offered insight, advice, and potential strategies. One colleague suggested connecting with influential clients who frequented the restaurant. Another suggested leveraging social media in a measured, professional way. And a third suggested a subtle public statement in the form of an article or post that highlighted the experience without being inflammatory. He listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions, and considering every angle. He wanted to be thorough. He didn't want to leave any detail unexamined. Every decision he made now could have consequences, not just for him, but for the restaurant, the staff, and the message he was sending. He wanted to be precise, intentional, and deliberate. After the calls, he returned to his desk and reviewed the information again. He looked at the ownership structure of the restaurant, noting key names and decision-makers. He looked at online reviews, highlighting any patterns of behavior that suggested discrimination or poor management. He looked at social media, noting the presence of influencers or journalists who might take interest in a story like this. Each detail mattered. Each connection could be leveraged. He also thought about the staff involved. He didn't want to punish anyone unfairly, but he did want accountability. He wanted the people responsible for the behavior he had experienced to face consequences, not as revenge, but as a lesson that professionalism, respect, and fairness were not optional. He made a mental note to ensure that any action he took would be fair, measured, and rooted in justice rather than emotion. As the afternoon passed, he felt a quiet sense of focus settle over him. The initial sting of humiliation was still there, but it had been replaced by a clear sense of purpose. He knew exactly what he needed to do next: gather information, consult trusted advisors, and plan a response that would be intelligent, effective, and fair. He would not act impulsively. He would not let anger dictate his actions. He would act strategically, thoughtfully, and decisively. He took a short walk outside to clear his mind. The city was alive with activity, the streets crowded with people going about their daily lives. As he walked, he thought about the broader implications of the incident. This wasn't just a personal affront. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that affected countless people every day. He realized that his response could do more than address his own humiliation. It could serve as an example, a lesson, and perhaps even a catalyst for change. Returning to his office, he felt renewed determination. He reviewed his plan once more, considering every step carefully. He would gather more information, consult his network, and craft a response that was both powerful and precise. He would not act rashly or out of anger. Instead, he would act with intelligence, strategy, and professionalism. He knew that the next few hours would be critical. Every decision, every action, every word mattered. He was determined to ensure that the incident would not be forgotten, that accountability would be enforced, and that justice would be served, not as a matter of revenge, but as a demonstration of the principles he believed in. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, he sat at his desk and reviewed his notes one last time. He felt a calm determination, a quiet confidence that the plan he had formed would be effective. The humiliation he had experienced earlier in the day was still there, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a source of pain. It was a source of motivation, clarity, and focus. He knew that the restaurant and the staff responsible would soon understand the consequences of their actions. But more importantly, he knew that he had acted in a way that was intelligent, professional, and principled. He had turned a moment of personal humiliation into an opportunity for justice, reflection, and strategic action. As he prepared for the next steps, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had faced challenges before, and he had overcome them. He had been underestimated, dismissed, and ignored, yet he had built a successful career and earned the respect of many. This incident, though painful, would be no different. He would meet it with intelligence, strategy, and professionalism, and in doing so, he would not only address his own experience but also make a broader statement about fairness, respect, and accountability. With that thought in mind, he closed his notebook, took a deep breath, and prepared to act. The next part of the story was about to unfold, and he was ready to face it with focus, determination, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew that justice, when pursued intelligently, could be powerful, fair, and enduring. After spending the afternoon reflecting and planning, he knew it was time to move from thought to action. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and started drafting a list. Not a list of grievances or complaints, but a precise map of the steps he could take. Every decision, every connection, every resource at his disposal mattered now. The humiliation he had faced earlier in the day still lingered, but it had transformed into a fuel that pushed him forward. This was no longer just about one lunch. It was about principle, fairness, and making sure that a subtle act of discrimination did not go unnoticed. He began with his network. Over the years, he had built relationships with countless people across industries, clients, partners, friends, and associates. He thought about who frequented the restaurant, who might influence the business, and who would understand the gravity of the situation. He picked up the phone and started making calls, carefully choosing words that conveyed the facts without inflaming emotions. He described what had happened: the refusal of service, the manager's avoidance, and the subtle discriminatory behavior. Each call was deliberate. Each listener he spoke to became a potential ally, someone who could help amplify the message or apply pressure in a strategic way. Some of the people he called were surprised at first. They couldn't believe a restaurant in the heart of the city would behave like that. Others were quiet, absorbing the details, understanding that there was more beneath the surface than a single incident. With each conversation, he gained a sense of control. He wasn't helpless anymore. He wasn't just the person humiliated outside a restaurant. He was the strategist, the planner, and the one who could turn a moment of injustice into a demonstration of accountability. As he worked, he began to draft a professional statement. Not a rant. Not a post filled with anger. Something measured, clear, and factual. He wanted to make the experience public in a way that would matter, that would be read, considered, and shared, without compromising his professionalism. He spent hours choosing each word, ensuring that the tone was calm but firm, factual but compelling. He highlighted the experience, the subtle yet undeniable discrimination, and the broader implications for anyone who might encounter such treatment. At the same time, he thought about the restaurant from a business perspective. He researched their investors, the ownership structure, and any other locations they operated. He knew that businesses respond when consequences affect reputation, customer loyalty, and revenue. With each detail he uncovered, he felt a growing sense of possibility. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about using the tools he had to ensure that the restaurant understood that professionalism and respect were non-negotiable. By mid-afternoon, his plan had taken shape. He would reach out to business partners, clients, and influential figures who had ties to the restaurant. He would use social media to share a professional account of the incident, ensuring it reached the right audience. And he would continue gathering information, monitoring reactions, and adjusting his strategy as needed. Every move would be intentional, precise, and impactful. He paused for a moment, looking out the window at the city below. People hurried past, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded earlier, and even more unaware of the ripple effects that were about to follow. The contrast struck him. Life for most people went on without interruption, yet for some, these small acts of injustice could leave lasting scars. He reminded himself that this was bigger than himself. This was about fairness, visibility, and principle. Then he started contacting people. Each phone call was deliberate. He described the situation clearly, emphasizing the facts without embellishment. "I want you to understand the circumstances," he said to one client. "It's not just about me. It's about a pattern, about accountability, and about ensuring that businesses uphold a standard of respect." Some listened quietly, others expressed outrage, and a few immediately began thinking about how they could help. Within an hour, he had contacted several influential figures, each capable of making a difference through their own networks and platforms. While he worked through his contacts, he also monitored the restaurant's social media presence. He noticed small patterns in reviews and comments, some praising service, others hinting at unfair treatment. He took notes, making connections and seeing opportunities to amplify the message without creating unnecessary conflict. His goal wasn't to humiliate. It was to make the consequences of poor judgment and discriminatory behavior visible to those who could influence change. By late afternoon, the first ripple effects began. One of his calls had reached a business partner who had booked a private event at the restaurant in a few weeks. After hearing the details, the partner immediately canceled the reservation and mentioned the reason. Another call reached an influential client who shared the account professionally with colleagues, creating subtle awareness of the issue. Each step was careful, strategic, and deliberate. The CEO watched the effects grow with a quiet satisfaction. He then turned to the professional statement he had drafted. He posted it on his company's official page, carefully wording it to maintain professionalism. It was clear, concise, and factual, describing what had happened, highlighting the broader implications, and calling for fairness and accountability without using inflammatory language. Within minutes, responses started to come in. Messages of support, shared experiences, and professional inquiries flooded his inbox. People appreciated the measured approach, recognizing that the post was not about personal anger but about principle. Even as he monitored the response, he continued planning his next moves. He thought about the staff involved, the hostess, the manager, and anyone else responsible. He didn't want to attack them personally. He wanted accountability at the level of decision-making. He knew that in businesses like this, individual actions often reflected systemic problems. His approach would ensure that the right people faced consequences not in anger, but in fairness and professional responsibility. As evening approached, he reviewed all the information he had gathered throughout the day: calls, social media activity, client responses, and patterns of behavior at the restaurant. Every piece of data reinforced his strategy. He felt a sense of control and purpose that contrasted sharply with the helplessness he had felt when first refused entry. The situation had shifted. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was the orchestrator of a carefully planned response. He reflected on the contrast between the humiliation he had experienced and the power he now wielded. It was remarkable, he thought, how quickly the balance could shift when one approached a situation with intelligence and strategy. The restaurant had assumed that ignoring the incident would keep it hidden, that small acts of discrimination would go unnoticed. But through careful planning, measured action, and the support of his network, he had already begun to turn the situation around. He thought about the staff again, imagining their reactions if they realized the impact of their actions. He didn't wish them harm, but he wanted them to understand that professionalism and fairness were essential. Actions have consequences, he reminded himself, and those consequences could be powerful, visible, and instructive. By nightfall, the story was beginning to take shape. The restaurant's reputation was quietly affected by canceled reservations, subtle shifts in client plans, and growing awareness within professional networks. The CEO felt a sense of satisfaction not from revenge, but from the realization that strategic, thoughtful action could transform a moment of injustice into a lesson for others. He knew there was still work to do. Monitoring the situation, responding to inquiries, and adjusting the strategy would take time. But for the first time since the incident, he felt calm, focused, and in control. The humiliation he had faced earlier in the day had not disappeared, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a source of shame. It was a catalyst for thoughtful action, deliberate planning, and the pursuit of fairness. Late in the evening, he sat back and reflected on what had been accomplished. The initial calls, the professional statement, the monitoring of the restaurant's presence, all of it had set the stage for the next phase. The situation was no longer passive. It was active, dynamic, and moving in a direction that reflected intelligence, fairness, and strategic thinking. He had turned a personal affront into a professional opportunity to demonstrate the power of thoughtful, principled action. Before leaving the office, he reviewed his plan one last time. The next steps were clear. Continue monitoring reactions, ensure accountability for the staff and management, and use the situation as a teaching moment for fairness and professionalism. Every action had to be deliberate, every word measured, and every decision intentional. This was about more than a single restaurant or a single incident. It was about demonstrating the importance of respect, fairness, and strategic response in the face of injustice. He shut down his laptop, leaned back in his chair, and let himself breathe. The city outside was quiet now, the hum of evening traffic filling the streets. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of purpose, and a calm confidence that the situation was unfolding exactly as it should. The humiliation of earlier had been transformed into motivation, clarity, and strategy. He was no longer reacting. He was leading, guiding, and shaping the outcome. As he left the office for the night, he knew that the story was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, decisions to make, and responses to manage. But for the first time since stepping out of that restaurant, he felt empowered. He had taken control of the narrative, used his resources wisely, and set in motion a chain of events that would ensure accountability, fairness, and visibility. The day's events had started with humiliation, but they were now moving toward justice, resolution, and a powerful lesson for those who had underestimated the situation. He walked to his car with a calm determination, thinking about the next phase of action, the steps to follow, and the impact his response would have. 1 hour had passed since he began executing his plan, and already the situation had shifted dramatically. The restaurant, the staff, and the wider community were now facing consequences, not because of anger or revenge, but because of deliberate, intelligent, and principled action. As he drove home that night, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The experience had been painful, but it had also been transformative. He realized that moments of injustice, when met with intelligence and strategy, could be powerful opportunities to demonstrate principle, fairness, and the importance of respect. And as he reflected on the day, he knew that the next steps would be even more impactful, ensuring that the lesson was understood, remembered, and shared beyond a single restaurant. a single staff, or a single city street. The morning after executing the first steps of his plan, he woke up early with a sense of quiet determination. The city was just beginning to stir, the hum of traffic and distant voices blending into a familiar rhythm. He sipped his coffee slowly, thinking about the events of the previous day. The humiliation of being turned away from the restaurant still lingered, but now it was coupled with a sense of control. He had moved from being a victim to someone who could influence outcomes, someone who could ensure that fairness and accountability were not just ideas but actions with consequences. He reviewed the results of his efforts so far. The phone calls to clients and business partners had begun to take effect. Several high-profile reservations had been canceled, some subtly and some publicly. The restaurant's social media channels were already experiencing subtle pressure as people began discussing professionalism, fairness, and respect. His professional statement had been read and shared by influential contacts, creating a ripple effect that was quietly but significantly affecting the restaurant's image. Every step he had taken was purposeful, deliberate, and effective. He didn't rush. He had learned that the most effective strategies often required patience. Acting impulsively could create mistakes or unintended consequences. Instead, he focused on monitoring responses, evaluating the effects of his actions, and planning the next moves. He thought about the staff, the hostess, the manager, and others involved. They had acted with poor judgment, but his goal wasn't to humiliate individuals unnecessarily. It was to ensure accountability, fairness, and professionalism, teaching a lesson that would resonate beyond a single restaurant. By mid-morning, he began contacting more people in his professional network. This time he reached out to journalists, food critics, and influencers who often reviewed restaurants. He didn't exaggerate, insult, or vent anger. Instead, he presented the facts, highlighting the incident, the behavior of the staff, and the broader implications for customer service and fairness. The response was immediate. Some journalists expressed interest in covering the story, not as a scandal, but as a case of professional accountability. Influencers began discussing fairness and respectful treatment in service industries, using his account as a reference point. Meanwhile, the restaurant itself began to feel the consequences. Management noticed a sudden shift in reservations, cancellations from high-profile clients, and subtle inquiries from investors concerned about their reputation. The initial assumption that the incident would be ignored and forgotten was no longer valid. The small act of discrimination had begun to create tangible repercussions, and the restaurant's leadership could no longer pretend it didn't exist. He remained calm as the situation unfolded. Sitting at his desk, he monitored social media, client responses, and internal reports from his assistant. Every movement, every reaction from the restaurant provided insight into how effective his strategy had been. It was a delicate balance. He wanted consequences to occur without unnecessary escalation. His focus was on fairness, accountability, and professionalism, and so far the plan was working exactly as intended. By late morning, a subtle shift occurred within the restaurant's operations. Staff members involved in the incident began to feel the pressure. Reservations had been canceled, inquiries had been made, and word of the incident was circulating in the professional community. The hostess and manager who had acted dismissively the day before were now aware that their actions had repercussions. Management realized that ignoring the situation could have long-term consequences for the business. They had assumed that turning away a single customer would be inconsequential, but the reality was very different. The CEO remained deliberate.
He did not celebrate small victories, nor did he take pleasure in the restaurant's discomfort.
His goal was fairness, accountability, and visibility. He wanted the lesson to be understood, not lost in anger or personal vindication. He spent the day monitoring, analyzing, and adjusting his approach as needed. Every decision was intentional, every action measured, every response calculated. This was strategy in action, guided by principle, not emotion. By mid-afternoon, the situation had escalated further. Clients who had initially canceled reservations began discussing the incident with other potential customers. Investors and business partners began questioning the restaurant's management, asking for explanations and reassurance about the behavior of staff and policies regarding discrimination. The ripple effect had become tangible, creating pressure that could no longer be ignored. The restaurant, which had assumed the incident was minor, was now facing significant consequences that threatened both its reputation and its business. He continued to act with precision. He reached out to a few more influential figures, providing them with a professional account of the incident. Each conversation was calm, factual, and measured. He emphasized the importance of accountability, professionalism, and fair treatment. He didn't seek revenge. He sought understanding and systemic improvement. The result was a growing awareness, a network of people who understood the implications, and a quiet but powerful pressure on the restaurant's leadership. By early evening, the first direct response from the restaurant came. A senior manager reached out asking for a private conversation. They wanted to understand what had happened and how to resolve the situation. He agreed, but only under conditions that ensured professionalism and accountability. The meeting would not be a negotiation about his feelings. It would be a discussion about consequences, lessons, and corrective actions. During the conversation, he remained calm and composed. He described the incident factually, emphasizing the behavior of the staff and the broader implications for the business. He listened to the manager's responses but did not accept excuses or deflections. He made it clear that fairness and accountability were non-negotiable. The restaurant's management began to understand the gravity of the situation. They realized that the incident had caused reputational damage, affected relationships with clients, and exposed weaknesses in staff training and management oversight. By the end of the conversation, it was agreed that corrective action would be taken. The staff involved would face consequences, policies would be reviewed and strengthened, and the incident would be acknowledged in a professional and transparent manner. The CEO had achieved his goal, not through anger, not through retaliation, but through intelligence, strategy, and principled action. As he left the meeting, he reflected on the day's events. The humiliation he had experienced the previous day had been transformed into a powerful demonstration of accountability and fairness. He had turned a personal affront into a lesson for others, a visible example of how intelligent, deliberate action could address injustice. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not from the discomfort of others, but from the knowledge that the situation had been handled with professionalism and principle. By nightfall, the ripple effects were clear. The restaurant's reputation had shifted, staff were being held accountable, and the professional community had taken notice. The incident, which had begun as a moment of personal humiliation, had evolved into a case study in strategic response, accountability, and the importance of principle. The CEO's actions had demonstrated that fairness, intelligence, and composure could turn adversity into meaningful change. He spent the evening reflecting on the journey so far. He thought about the initial shock, the humiliation, the careful planning, and the strategic execution. Each step had been intentional, each action guided by principle, and each decision aimed at achieving fairness and accountability. He realized that the incident had provided an opportunity, not just to correct a wrong, but to demonstrate a broader lesson about respect, professionalism, and the power of strategic action. As he prepared for the next day, he felt a sense of calm determination. The staff involved had been held accountable, management had acknowledged the mistake, and the professional community had taken notice. The restaurant had learned a powerful lesson, one that would resonate long after the immediate consequences had passed. The CEO had turned humiliation into strategy, unfair treatment into accountability, and a personal affront into a demonstration of principle. The city outside had quieted, the streets emptying as night fell. He sat at his desk one last time, reviewing the day's events, monitoring responses, and preparing for the next steps. The ripple effect of his actions was still unfolding, and he knew that continued vigilance was necessary. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, a chance to acknowledge the transformation of the day's events from humiliation to justice, from personal affront to systemic awareness. He thought about the staff, the management, and the broader implications for businesses everywhere. He realized that the lesson was not just about a single restaurant or a single incident. It was about fairness, accountability, and the importance of responding to injustice with intelligence, strategy, and principle. He had achieved something significant, not by acting out of anger, but by acting with purpose. As he left the office that night, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The day had begun with tension and uncertainty, but it had ended with clarity and impact. He had turned a personal humiliation into a professional demonstration of accountability. He had ensured that fairness and respect were not optional, that actions have consequences, and that intelligence and strategy could transform adversity into meaningful change. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new reactions, and continued consequences for the restaurant and its staff. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to feel the power of what had been accomplished. The lesson was clear. Humiliation can be transformed into strategy, injustice can be addressed with intelligence, and principle can guide every action. And with that thought, he walked into the night calm, composed, and confident in the knowledge that the situation had been handled with integrity, professionalism, and unwavering principle. The morning after the first waves of consequences hit the restaurant, he woke up early feeling a calm sense of satisfaction. The humiliation he had faced just 2 days ago was now a distant memory, replaced by the knowledge that the situation was transforming into a lesson in fairness, accountability, and professional integrity. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the city slowly come alive. Life went on outside, unaware of the chain of events unfolding because of one moment of injustice. He spent the morning reviewing updates. Clients, business partners, and influential figures had reacted exactly as expected. Several had shared his professional statement on social media, creating a ripple effect of awareness that extended far beyond the restaurant itself. The management team of the restaurant had begun implementing changes, reviewing staff behavior, and holding meetings to address the underlying issues that had caused the incident. The first steps of accountability were being taken, and he felt a quiet pride, not because he had humiliated anyone, but because fairness and principle were prevailing. He decided it was time to ensure that the lesson reached the staff who had been involved. While the restaurant's leadership was taking steps to address their behavior, he felt it was important for the individuals to understand the consequences of their actions firsthand. He reached out to the manager directly, arranging a private conversation. The discussion was firm but professional. He did not seek revenge, ridicule, or punishment for the sake of anger. His goal was simple: accountability, learning, and awareness. He explained calmly how their actions had impacted not only him personally, but the restaurant's reputation and business. He emphasized the broader message, that respect and professionalism were non-negotiable and that the slightest disregard could have far-reaching consequences. The manager listened quietly, occasionally offering explanations, but he did not accept excuses. He highlighted specific behaviors, the ripple effects that had emerged, and the responsibility of leadership to guide staff appropriately. The conversation was uncomfortable for the manager, but it was honest, fair, and purposeful. By the end, there was an understanding. Accountability would be enforced and changes would be made to prevent such incidents in the future. The staff involved were informed of their consequences and began to understand the seriousness of their actions. Satisfied with this step, he turned his attention back to the broader community. The story was no longer confined to a single restaurant or a personal experience. It had become a lesson in fairness, accountability, and the power of measured action. He drafted a follow-up professional statement, this time highlighting the importance of learning from mistakes, implementing fair practices, and the need for businesses everywhere to ensure their staff upheld basic standards of respect. The tone was educational, positive, and professional. It was not about shaming anyone, but about creating awareness and inspiring improvement. As the day progressed, he monitored the responses. The reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. People appreciated the calm, strategic, and professional approach he had taken. Many shared stories of their own experiences with unfair treatment, and several businesses reached out to learn from the way he had handled the situation. He realized that the impact of his actions extended far beyond the restaurant. It had become an example of how intelligence, composure, and strategy could turn a negative experience into a powerful lesson. The restaurant, meanwhile, continued to feel the effects. Management had begun reviewing policies, reinforcing training, and making adjustments to prevent future issues. Staff members involved in the incident had been reassigned or removed, ensuring that accountability was visible and clear. The ripple effect extended to clients who had initially been unaware of the situation, as many were now discussing professionalism, fairness, and the importance of respectful treatment in service industries. He watched the changes unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the outcome was a direct result of deliberate, intelligent, and principled action. Throughout the day, he reflected on the transformation that had taken place. 2 days ago, he had been standing outside the restaurant, humiliated, confused, and hurt. Today, he had turned that experience into a series of strategic actions that produced meaningful consequences. He had remained calm, thoughtful, and deliberate, and the results spoke for themselves. Humiliation had been replaced by empowerment, injustice by accountability, and anger by strategy. He spent the afternoon speaking with colleagues and friends about the broader implications. The story had become a case study in how to handle discrimination and unfair treatment with intelligence and composure. He emphasized the importance of gathering information, remaining calm, consulting trusted advisors, and executing a strategy that was principled, fair, and effective. He explained that the goal was never revenge but accountability, and that by acting strategically, one could turn even the most negative experiences into meaningful change. In the evening, he reviewed social media and media coverage. Articles had been published highlighting the incident as an example of professional accountability. Influencers and industry leaders had shared the story, praising the way it had been handled. The narrative had shifted from one of personal humiliation to one of principle, intelligence, and fairness. He felt a quiet pride knowing that the story was inspiring others, creating awareness, and fostering change. The CEO also took the time to reach out to other businesses, sharing lessons learned from the experience. He offered guidance on how to implement fair practices, ensure staff were trained properly, and prevent incidents of discrimination or poor service. His approach was calm, professional, and constructive. He emphasized learning and improvement rather than punishment or humiliation. The responses were positive, with several businesses expressing gratitude and committing to improvements. By nightfall, he reflected on the entire journey. The incident had started as a personal humiliation, a moment where he had been dismissed unfairly. It had transformed into a lesson in strategic response, professional accountability, and the power of principled action. The restaurant had been held accountable, staff had learned the consequences of their actions, and the broader community had taken note of the importance of fairness and respect. The ripple effects would continue, creating awareness and inspiring better practices in businesses far beyond the city. He realized that the story was not just about a restaurant or staff behavior. It was about how individuals respond to injustice. It was about turning negative experiences into opportunities for meaningful change. It was about remaining calm, thinking strategically, and acting with principle. And most importantly, it was about demonstrating that intelligence and professionalism could transform humiliation into empowerment and injustice into accountability. The CEO felt a sense of completion. The staff responsible had been addressed. Management had acknowledged their role, and the broader community had absorbed the lessons. The incident, once painful, had become an example of how strategy, composure, and principle could lead to meaningful consequences. He had shown that even when faced with humiliation, one could act with intelligence, fairness, and grace, producing results that went far beyond personal vindication. He sat back in his chair and reflected on the broader implications. Life is unpredictable, he thought. People face challenges, unfair treatment, and moments of humiliation every day, but how one responds to those moments defines not only the immediate outcome, but also the long-term impact. By remaining calm, gathering information, consulting trusted advisors, and executing a strategic response, individuals could ensure that fairness and accountability prevailed. The story had come full circle. From the initial shock of being turned away, through careful reflection, strategic planning, and deliberate execution, the CEO had transformed a personal affront into a lesson that would resonate far beyond a single restaurant. It was a story of principle, intelligence, and strategy,